You'll recall from the first video lecture on how to construct a brief for the first affirmative constructive speech that a brief reduces a lot of information into an outline of the essential argumentative elements of the proposition. And we went into detail on how the brief for the first affirmative speech is constructed. But whether you support or oppose the resolution or the proposition, you will likely prepare other briefs, and that's what this video lecture focuses on. We'll start out with more discussion on briefs, the various types of briefs, and finally the format of the negative's constructive speech. Again, for the purpose of this video lecture, we will use the terms affirmative to refer to the team or the debater advocating a change in the status quo, and negative to refer to the team or the debater opposing a change and supporting the status quo. But let's address first what a brief is not. It is not a single argument. And it is not a single argument supported by evidence. Instead, think of a brief as an extended argument, developing a point. And as identified earlier, a brief can be used by the affirmative, prepared to support the resolution, or negative, opposing the resolution. If you are affirmative, you will definitely be using your brief for the first affirmative constructive speech. And that one is likely to be a long brief, spanning multiple pages, as the affirmative must meet the prima facie burden at the outset. This means that it must present a clear and compelling reason to make a change and offer the change to be made, enough that, upon first hearing it, a reasonable and prudent person would consider it to be sufficient and logical. But if you've spent time asking yourself what-if questions, what if my opponent says X, you may have prepared lots of briefs, both affirmative and negative. However, any other briefs you prepare may or may not be used, depending upon the direction that the debate takes. Again, briefs include arguments that you plan to make, as well as various arguments that you could make. But a brief can also include possible counter-arguments, what you might add, or how you might respond if you were questioned. And regardless, a brief will include the evidence that can be used to support those arguments. For example, if you are proposing that capital punishment should be abolished, you're the affirmative, you might plan to talk about how capital punishment is unconstitutional, not uniformly applied, etc. If your opponent argues that capital punishment is effective as a deterrent for others, essentially reducing crime, you might want to be prepared for that. So you would prepare a brief that, if that argument were made, you would be able to apply and have the correct evidence at hand. Of course, if your opponent fails to make that argument, you would not use the brief, but it's good to have it on hand just in case. But when you are the negative, you don't really know exactly what the affirmative will say. You could predict that the affirmative will likely make some arguments related to constitutionality, that it's cruel and unusual punishment, so you would prepare a brief to address that point. It's almost like a chess game, with you predicting what your opponent will do and being prepared, regardless of which move they make. So briefs can be used as a just-in-case strategy. You would brainstorm arguments that your opponents might make, come up with responses and evidence in a brief, and then use them if those arguments apply or come up. And again, a debate brief is usually prepared in outline form, using a version of the standard outlining numbering convention. Now, as you know, we've discussed the brief for the first affirmative constructive speech in a previous video, but there are other types of briefs you can put together as well. Just as you can argue offensively, advancing your own arguments for consideration, you can also argue defensively, responding to criticisms of your arguments, and you can prepare briefs for both of those scenarios. If you are negative, you can also prepare a brief that explains your philosophy. Generally, this is a developed argument that claims the negative's intent to uphold the status quo, by refuting the need for a change, by explaining that the problem is not significant enough to justify the reason for the change, denying that the present system or the status quo is contributing to the problem, which is inherency. Also, why the affirmative's plan is worse than the present system, because it is unworkable or will cause more problems than it solves. In some cases, the negative will acknowledge that a problem exists, but propose minor repairs in the status quo that will solve the problem. Why throw the baby out with the bathwater if the bath just needs a little bit more warm water? A minor repair would be much better than making a whole policy change. You might also find that you have one argument that applies to multiple arguments that your opponent is making. You could create a brief that you could read as an observation. For example, that the needs of the many are more important than the needs of the few. But most of the time, you will prepare briefs for specific arguments. On the capital punishment topic, the affirmative can predict that the negative will argue that the problem is not big enough to worry about. It's only a very small percentage of criminals that capital punishment applies to. So perhaps it's worth preparing a brief to defend against or refute that argument. As the negative, you won't know exactly what the affirmative will say, but just by knowing the topic area, you'll likely have an educated guess. Using the capital punishment topic as an example, the negative can predict that the affirmative will claim that capital punishment is unconstitutional, costs too much money, clogs up the court system, kills innocent people, is morally wrong. Well, the list can go on. So you can prep for multiple scenarios. We can also classify the types of negative briefs based upon which part of the affirmative constructive speech they are addressing, case or plan. Going back to those same examples, a brief that is prepared to address an affirmative argument that there is a problem with the status quo or that it is inherent within the status quo is a case brief, while arguments that deal with the affirmative's plan to solve the problem would be plan briefs. Let's go into more detail on argument-specific briefs, which answer the what-if question. What if my opponent says X? How might I respond? Or what would I say in response to Y? Oftentimes, it's easy to predict what your opponent might say. If you're arguing against a gun control case, it's a pretty good bet that the issue of constitutionality is likely to come up. Or if you are affirmative on the same topic, you can predict that the negative will likely bring up a substitution argument that even if you take guns out of society, people will substitute other weapons such as knives. Preparing a brief on these topics will make it easier to respond if the arguments come up. Now I say if because you would only use one of these briefs if they apply to the arguments being made. If the negative doesn't argue constitutionality, it makes no sense to address it. Remember that a brief is not, however, a single argument that can be made in response to another argument. It is a developed argument with at least two arguments supporting the main argument followed by a statement of impact, why it is an important argument. Now the dashed arrows show that when using the brief in a speech, you may or may not read all of the arguments, depending upon time and circumstance, but that you have prepared them so that you can use them if needed. Here's a way to prepare an argument-specific brief. Put the expected argument at the top, which will make it easier for you to find if you need it. What do you think your opponent's argument will be? If you were negative on a capital punishment case, the expected affirmative argument might be that capital punishment is unconstitutional. If you are affirmative, you might predict that your opponent, the negative, will claim that your plan will cost too much money in court appeals. Remember, if you are addressing whether a harm or a problem does or does not exist, or if the harm is inherent in the status quo, this would be a case side argument. If, however, you are addressing whether the plan the affirmative is offering will solve the problem, or if it creates more problems than it solves, you would be arguing the plan. Let's use capital punishment, the constitutionality argument, as our example. Now, all of these arguments are drawn from death penalty, pro and con, last updated in 2013. Your first response might be that the death penalty does not violate the Fifth Amendment, which relates to due process. You could cite William D. Richardson, chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of South Dakota, and his colleagues in their 2002 book, The Leviathan Choice. In fact, Richardson goes further to claim that the Fifth Amendment can be read as evidence that the founders inherently supported the death penalty. Your second response might be that capital punishment also does not violate the Eighth Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment. You can quote the U.S. Supreme Court's decision written by Chief Justice John G. Roberts in the Bays v. Rees 2008 case. You could also cite that in 1958, the U.S. Supreme Court also concluded that capital punishment did not violate the Eighth Amendment. Now, you would also include the reasons given in these decisions, but I think you get the gist. You can further develop your point on the Eighth Amendment by arguing that even in the case of mentally retarded criminals, now that's the U.S. Supreme Court's word choice, not mine, or juveniles, the death penalty doesn't violate the Eighth Amendment. You could continue this discussion with the 14th Amendment, which addresses citizenship rights and equal protection of the laws. You would end with a statement of impact, which answers the question, why is this an important argument to consider when making a decision? You might say then that the Constitution is the foundation of a democracy, and in the United States, democracy is important. And if we violate the highest law in the land, we will be a nation ruled by men who can make decisions and mete out punishments on whims. And who wants to live in a world like that? Okay, as the negative, you've prepared all of your briefs. You also have lots of evidence and arguments that can stand by themselves without a brief. You've listened to the affirmative case and plan and are ready to respond. How will you organize your responses? What will you say? Let me remind you that it is the affirmative who sets up the debate's organization. The negative reacts to the affirmative's case and plan. This means that regardless of the various briefs that you might have prepared, you will only use them if they apply to the affirmative's arguments, and you will only use them in the order that the affirmative presented them, the order that they apply. There must be clash here, not just a different way of looking at it. For each point the affirmative brings up in their case, the negative should try to directly respond. Again, evidence is used where appropriate, read word for word, and with a source citation. You might start with a negative philosophy, which is your position in the debate. Again, usually a statement claiming your intent to uphold the status quo, indicating that the status quo is solving the harms now, and allude to the affirmative's plan not being workable or having too many disadvantages to consider voting for the affirmative. If you have any general arguments that may apply to more than one of the affirmative's arguments, or an important argument that doesn't directly clash with the affirmative's case, you can make an observation, sometimes called an overview. If you think the affirmative's definitions are inappropriate, you must explain why and offer counter definitions. Any topicality arguments claiming that the affirmative's case does not fall within the resolution would be made here. Now you move to the case, the reasons the affirmative is giving to justify their plan. Again, you'll follow the same organization the affirmative set forth in the first affirmative constructive speech, using evidence and reasoning where appropriate. If the affirmative argues that capital punishment is unconstitutional before they claim that it costs too much money to implement, you would respond to the constitutionality argument before addressing the cost argument. If you've been proactive in your thinking, you'll likely have a negative brief or two you can use here. Once you finish attacking the case, you'll move next to the affirmative's plan, attacking solvency. Explain how the affirmative's plan will not work. Point out that the affirmative plan will not meet the advantages that they claimed on case. In other words, it will not solve the problem. Explain any disadvantages of the affirmative plan. Again, if you've done some thinking, you will probably have a brief or two that can address these plan issues. You'll end with a brief conclusion, which is a short restatement of your negative philosophy and a request for a negative ballot. Processing time. What are the various types of brief that are likely to be used in an academic debate? Or perhaps more importantly, what types of briefs would be helpful to you on your debate topic? What is the format of an argument-specific brief? Now it's time for you to brainstorm all of those what-if questions so that you can be better prepared when it's time for you to debate.